thank you all so much for joining us for the Amistad Trials. This is the second in what will hopefully be a long series where Dennis talks about some of the great trials of I guess mankind, really. So the Amistad Trials is the first civil rights trial in American history. The issue of slavery versus freedom rears its ugly head in this American court battle more than 2 decades before the Civil War explodes in 1861. The case pits the American government against the Spanish government, the president against his own Secretary of State, our executive branch versus the judicial branch, and abolitionists against slave traders. It even prompted a former president to appear before the Supreme Court to condemn the policies of a present administration. So today's program is led by the Honorable Dennis J. Curran, who's a retired Massachusetts Superior Court Justice. He was a judge for 15 years, presided over 450 civil and criminal trials. He's the author of 42 book chapters and articles, and he has taught at Tufts University, Roger Williams University School of Law, and Brown University. So all 96 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dennis for joining us this afternoon. And Dennis, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert, and welcome to the second of our series entitled A Great Trials That Changed History. I'm going to start off with a movie clip. The best advertisement for this particular talk is a video clip from Steven Spielberg's movie, Amistad.
Detained by officers of the survey brig off the coast of Long Island. You can only assume that the charge is murder.
We do hereby claim salvage on the high seas of the Spanish ship La Amistad and all her cargo.
Your Honor,
here are the true owners of these slaves. These slaves, Your Honor, are by rights the property of Spain.
You and this young so-called lawyer have proven you know what they are. They're Africans. Congratulations. What you don't know is who they are.
This could take us all one long step closer to civil war.
immediately surrender these goods.
Our president has appealed the decision to our Supreme Court. We have to try the case again.
I will call into the past and beg my ancestors to come and help me, for at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
This is the most important case ever come before this court, because what it in fact concerns is freedom, the very nature of man. And the proof is the length to which a man will go to regain it once taken. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices, to get home.
The Amistad trial is the first civil rights trial in American history. Now, this afternoon, we focus on the great trial involving the slave ship La Amistad, A-M-I-S-T-A-D, which ironically means, in Spanish, friendship. It was anything but that, as the trailer for the movie Amistad, directed by Steven Spielberg, that we just saw demonstrates. The issue of slavery versus freedom rears its ugly head in this American court case more than 20 years before the Civil War explodes in 1861. The case pits the American government against the Spanish government, the president against his own Secretary of State, if you can believe that, our executive branch against the judicial branch, abolitionists against slave traders, and in the end, the slaves against their own protectors and defenders, the American Missionary Society. So let's just start to set the stage by talking about slavery in the early United States. Here is a diagram of a slave ship. Now, I know some of these diagrams and illustrative aids I'm going to be going through them, but I will post them with Robert later on this afternoon so that you can see them all in more detail, because I know there's not enough time in the hour to study them. But here is the diagram of a slave ship. This won't be your first glance at it, I guarantee you. And look at how the slaves are packed in there like sardines. Now, this was not the Amistad slave ship, but this is a slave ship with 292 slaves. Is it any wonder how many, that so many of them died on the trip from Africa to the Americas? And if you see in this bottom diagram, there's one for, the front section is for the men, boys are in the middle, and women towards the end. And here are several posters of slave auctions. And I'll be posting these later online, or with Robert's permission, so that you can study these. These are absolutely appalling posters that were strung around town to sell African Americans. $2,500 reward for a Negro man named George. And then another reward for someone named Noah and Hemp, and then Bob. And here, see if I can show this, and bear with me. And here, bear with me 1 second. Here is a poster behind me that you can see, that I discovered from my historical research from 1851.
So Dennis, I think when you were trying to move the panel, you accidentally stopped sharing your screen. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, so, oh, there we go. There we go. We're back.
Okay, but I wanted to go back. I wanted to show me, is that possible? I can do that.
Oh,
right?
oh, you meant to do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I meant to do that.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dennis.
Robert, neither of us are perfect, believe me.
Go for it.
But I wanted to show you this poster that's directly behind or over my right shoulder. Caution, colored people, one and all, you are hereby, let me turn and read it to you. Respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And then there's more, and they have already actually employed a kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves in doing so. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open is the bottom of the thing. And the fascinating thing of that, can you see where this poster was hung? Boston, folks. Boston. Boston. In 1790, slaves are counted in every state. I know this diagram is difficult to read, but I'll help you out. In every state except for Massachusetts and its districts of Vermont and Maine, there are no slaves in Massachusetts. And let me show you this. This is a copy of the United States Census for 1790. And thank God we can be proud. There we go. See if we get it right here. Massachusetts is at the bottom of the list. I didn't include all of it, but Massachusetts has 95,000 white males over the total population was 378,000 over here, and Massachusetts has 0 slaves. Our state's highest court, the Supreme Judicial Court. Let me just clear this, please. And undo. Okay. Here we go. Okay, I'm sorry. Our state's highest court in 1783 in the Elizabeth Freeman case abolished slavery in 1783. Now, overall, about 18% of the American population are enslaved. In the early United States, let's just look at these numbers. 43%, almost half of the people who lived in South Carolina were slaved. Virginia, 39%, and you can see the other numbers, very significant numbers. Let me see if I can clear this. Okay. I want to clear these numbers. There we go. I'm so sorry. All right. Now, before we look down our collective noses to condemn the South through the lens of our northern moral superiority, consider the following question. Was New England involved in the importation of slaves? The answer, absolutely. That sign, Bristol, Rhode Island, which says underneath, the subtitle is Home of America's oldest 4th of July celebration, should actually say, welcome to the second busiest slave importation port city in the United States. Parenthetically, second only to Charleston, South Carolina. Yes, folks, slaves were heavily imported into New England. At one time, Bristol, Rhode Island was the second busiest port for the importation of slaves. Now, I'm going to show you some photographs of existing buildings, photographs that I've taken myself to document this crime against humanity. This is the very warehouse in Bristol Harbor, Bristol, Rhode Island, that still stands where African slaves were housed. Underwent some renovations, which I took photographs of. This is the warehouse in which African slaves were warehoused. The DeWolfs, DEWOLFS, completed this warehouse in 1818. Many stones that constructed that building came from Africa and were used as ballast for the slave ships. Ballast means to balance out the ships. It is ironic that the African stones were used to construct a building to house enslaved African people in America. Now, over time, the DeWolf family, now we all know the DeWolf family from seeing their real estate signs, same family, my friends, was responsible for financing, in whole or in part, 88 slave trips, which accounted for nearly 60% of all African voyages that arrived in Bristol. They brought in an estimated 30,000 kidnapped and captured Africans to Cuba, West Indies, and the American South. Unlike other slave traders, the DeWolfs even took orders from Bristol, Rhode Island residents for slaves and delivered them directly upon arrival. Rhode Island was among the most active northern colonies in importing slaves, and between 1709 and 1807, about 100 years, Rhode Island merchants carried an estimated 1,000 slaves to the New World. Now, here is the DeWolf Tavern. Now, you've seen the old photos. This is a promotional photograph. That warehouse that housed slaves has now been renovated and is now a restaurant. Yes, a restaurant. And here it is, the interior, and I've been in there before it was renovated, and I took photographs of it. That's how it now looks. A Chi-Chi restaurant, not likely that many patrons of this tavern would know that they are having dinner and drinks on the precise spot where African slaves were chained to those walls. This is the triangular trade between, as you can see, the Gold Coast down here. Let me just annotate this for you, if I may. The slaves started out on the Gold Coast, and we'll see this in a little bit. In Africa, the destination for them was Barbados, oftentimes, and Cuba, and then they went up to Newport, and then they went back to with different items of trade. So let me clear that and just show you. You know, a friend of mine once said, well, why didn't the slaves just rebel against their owners? Well, you know, there's a couple of reasons for it, but the truth of it is they were rebellions. Let me just show you this historical account. There were slave rebellions in 1712 in New York, in 1800 in Richmond, 1811 in Louisiana, Charleston, South Carolina, the Haitian Rebellion, the famous Nat Turner Rebellion. In 1831 and 2, there were rebellions in Jamaica, and in the 1830s in Alabama, Mississippi, and Maryland, all people screaming for their freedom. And a matter of fact, let me show you this little sketch, Horrid Massacre in Virginia. It's the original document, and it was an outgrowth of the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia. And I'll read the caption to you because it's very difficult to read. The scenes above, I add the word above, are designed to represent a mother, number one, a mother entreating for her lives of her children. The second one, in the middle one, Mr. Travis cruelly murdered by his own slaves. And three, Mr. Barrow, who was protecting the life and life of his wife and his baby, and who were about to escape. But that's the white person's view of these rebellions. And getting back to why they didn't escape as much, first of all, a lot of them who, when they first came to this country, didn't know the language, didn't know English. Secondly, they had no money. They were kept as slaves. Oftentimes they were chained, and they didn't know where to go. They were kept close watch over. They had no idea where to go. The ones who did used the Northern Star as their guide and went only at night through thicket and wilderness down south. They just didn't know where to go. I mean, obviously there was an underground railroad, but there weren't many that had the courage or physical endurance to be able to walk, and that's what they did. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, probably 1,000 miles if you add it all together. In any event, back to our story. The year is 1839. We are just off the coast of Cuba, and the schooner La Amistad sails in the early morning darkness. On board are the ship's crew, 2 Cuban plantation owners, and 53 Africans bound for the slave markets of Cuba. The human cargo are 49 men and 4 children. Remarkably, a slave named Cinque, C-I-N-Q-U-E, manages to free himself and with his fellow captives sparks a mutiny that murders 3 crew members and leaves 1 African dead. 6 weeks later, the Amistad will be seized and brought to Connecticut, where the mutineers will face criminal charges in a controversial trial that will command the attention of presidents, monarchs, ambassadors, and eventually the United States Supreme Court. Now, how does this mutiny start? Cinque manages to break out of his padlock, which makes it possible to remove his chains. And along with others, they make their way onto the deck, picking up, these are called belaying, B-E-L-A-Y-I-N-G pins that are used in nautical travel, and barrel staves. And they bludgeon the ship's cook. More men escape their irons and swarm onto the deck. They open a box of cane knives, which are used to cut sugar cane. Two sailors who are keeping watch jump overboard. The ship captain kills one slave and mortally wounds another. The slaves kill the ship captain. And here is a sketch of that struggle. They make him seem heroic, hardly. The slaves kidnap the two plantation owners and the first mate, and they order the first mate to steer a course to Africa. But the new captain deceives the slaves, steering, and I'll show you this. This is the journey from Sierra Leone. They headed to Cuba. They go to Cuba and are on the way to Cuba. But then after the mutiny, they are adrift, so not adrift, but they sail, but in a zigzag direction based on whether it's day or night, as you can see, all the way up. And their first mate deceives them, and they're seized by a Coast Guard naval ship off the coast of Long Island. The ship, including its human and property cargo, are brought to New London, Connecticut. When the Amistad arrives in port, the story about the mutiny quickly spreads and is heard by a local anti-slavery activist. He quickly gathers the essential facts: the name of the ship, the name of the slave holders, the variety and value of the cargo, and what happened during that rebellion. He learns that the Africans had not been out of Africa long enough to have been subjects of Spain, as the first mate and the plantation owners claim, and that, in fact, none of them can speak anything but their native language. He discovers that the ship's papers have been falsified. Now, he knows that the slave trade is now illegal, and he predicts that the blacks, quote, had a perfect right to get their liberty by killing their crew and taking possession of the vessel. This, folks, is a natural opportunity for a national campaign. The activist writes urgent letters to abolitionists. He writes to the editor of the newsletter, The Emancipator, as well as to Roger Baldwin, a distinguished Connecticut attorney. The anti-slavery movement flies into action, sending word up about the case up and down the seacoast. And here's a New York Herald, old-fashioned newspaper that writes about the Amistad story, reporting that the, quote, abolitionists are moving heaven and earth to effectuate their release. Now, at the time, there's a growing global movement for abolition. It started, this is a fact that I find fascinating, and I wouldn't have expected it. It started in Great Britain with the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and spread to the British colonies about 20 to 25 years later. The two anti-slavery organizations of the day are, first, the New England Anti-Slave Society, formed in 1831, and then the American Anti-Slavery Society, formed around roughly the same time. That had 145 local societies in Massachusetts, et cetera, and a population of 250,000. A membership of 250,000. I remember there were only 17 million people in the United States at the time. Well, this is a significant movement. Now, both of these societies are inspired by the Second Great Awakening. a powerful religious movement, which is largely based in northern city churches. The abolition societies have a strong network, material support, meaning money, and an effective communication means. Back to the Amistad. The two Cuban plantation owners filed criminal charges of murder and conspiracy against the Africans. A preliminary court hearing is held to determine whether there is a basis for going forward with a criminal trial. Witnesses for the government are called, but none for the Africans, who can neither speak nor understand English. And after hearing testimony, obviously from only one side, the judge orders all the defendants to stand trial for murder and piracy. And they will be held in the meantime in the county jail in New Haven. The prisoners are now an object of curiosity. 4,000 visitors come from all parts of Connecticut, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, and from as far away as Philadelphia to see the Africans. The jailer charges visitors to look at the slaves. Each visitor must pay 1 shilling, this is a shilling, about 12 cents to take a look at them. And the jail becomes a circus. Abolitionists see the arrival of the Africans as an opportunity. One of the abolitionist leaders calls their capture a providential occurrence that would touch the heart of the nation through the power of sympathy. Abolitionists see this as an opportunity to expose the inhumanity of slavery. They form a defense committee, which hires Roger Baldwin to represent the Africans. Now, communications are difficult between Baldwin and the Africans, so they hire a linguist from Yale College and an African interpreter. And through those interpreters, Baldwin, shown here, learns that the Africans have come from 6 different tribes and had only been in Cuba a short time before their sale at a slave market in Havana. The fact that the slaves had only recently come from Africa is a significant legal factor in this case, as we'll soon see. You see, more than 30 years before, a treaty had been signed between Great Britain and Spain in 1817. Now, this is not the actual treaty. This is an earlier treaty, but it shows you what these documents look like. It's called a convention between His Britannic Majesty and the King of Spain. This one was from 1786. I couldn't find one from 1817. But it outlawed African slave trade, and it declared all Africans who arrived in the Spanish ports free, including those in Spanish possessions such as Cuba. That treaty obviously applies to the Amistad slaves, and coming into Cuba 30 years later, that they should be declared free. However, the plantation owners presented falsified documents issued from the slave market in Havana. Those papers claimed that all of the Amistad slaves were either born in Cuba or were longtime residents of Cuba. Now, if that's true, it makes them lawful slaves. But the documents are obviously fraudulent. The truth is, the slaves couldn't even speak a word of English. The Cubans, the Spanish, and the United States government all take the same position that the judiciary has no business in examining the question of fraud. The court should look no further than the documents themselves. And because those papers indicate that each African is a lawful slave and even lists the Spanish name for each slave, that should be good enough. Pretty good forgery when you think about it. Enter into the story President Martin Van Buren, who orders his Secretary of State to return those slaves to Spain. He's concerned with keeping good relations with the government with Spain as well as with other countries. But the president's own Secretary of State, John Forsyth, refuses and counters that the matter is for the federal courts to decide, and that the executive branch has no authority to dictate to the judicial branch what is lawful or unlawful. When you consider it, this is a morally courageous position, considering that he is defying his own boss, the President of the United States. The Africans are taken to Hartford, where 2 federal judges and a grand jury are waiting for them. Lawyers, reporters, and curiosity seekers fill the town. The federal grand jury is tasked with considering whether or not to indict the Africans for murder and piracy, and if they do, a criminal trial will follow. A civil trial, considering whether the Africans are indeed property, proceeds simultaneously in a different courtroom in the same courthouse. The grand jury, after deliberation and taking of evidence, finds that the killings and mutinies did not occur within the territorial waters of the United States, and therefore the United States has no jurisdiction over the matter. Now, why is that? First of all, what is jurisdiction? What does jurisdiction mean? It means, folks, the power of a court to adjudicate cases and issue orders. If a court has no jurisdiction, they can't hear the case. So the grand jury finds that the crimes, if committed, occurred against Spanish citizens on a Spanish ship in Spanish waters, and that jurisdiction rests in Spain or its possessions. Despite ruling that the Africans cannot be charged criminally in the United States, a federal judge, though, refuses to release the Africans. He believes that the court has the right to keep the Africans in custody until it can determine whether anyone holds a property interest in them. And there were actually 5 courts that heard the Amistad case. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on this stuff, but I just wanted to give you a quick summary. There was a hearing on the dock of the U.S. brig Washington on the docks of New London, Connecticut. There was a second hearing held in Connecticut, and then a third hearing on the issue brought by Louis Japan against the ship owners. A 4th hearing in New York, and then finally we'll hear about this United States Supreme Court hearing eventually. Here are the many political and legal issues presented by this issue of the Amistad case, captives, and trials. Murder, sovereignty, salvage claims, slavery versus freedoms. What are the rules of the high seas that govern? The Spanish-American Treaty of 1795 and its interpretation. The issues of the presidential versus judicial power, the issue of whether the courts in the United States had jurisdiction, and the relationships with foreign governments. In other words, it's a tangled legal issue. Now, in the civil trial, abolitionist lawyers argue that the Africans are no one's property and are entitled to their freedom. They offer witnesses and evidence of the Africans' non-Cuban origins. And Simke, testifying through an interpreter, describes how he had been kidnapped in Africa 5 months earlier and manacled, handed foot, in the 2-month-long voyage across the Atlantic. The Cubans claim that the Africans are slaved, lawfully bought in a nation where slaveholding is legal. Cuba, slaveholding is legal. They argue that the Africans should be returned to the Cubans as their property. And then, folks, the shenanigans begin. The President of the United States, anticipating a favorable decision from the court, issues a secret and controversial order to the United States Marshal in Connecticut. The order says that the minute the judge announces his decision, granting custody to the president, the marshal is to rush the Africans onto a waiting ship, which would sail for Cuba before the African lawyers had time to file an appeal. 2 days later, the judge announces his decision. He finds that the commander of the ship that seized the Amistad has performed a valuable service and awards him 1/3 of the value of the ship and its non-human cargo. The ship and its cargo, subject to the salvage lien, are to be restored and returned to the Spanish government. But the federal judge rules that there is no salvage right to the Africans. They are no one's property. They are born free and by law are still free. They will not be returned to Cuba to stand trial as accused murderers and pirates. Enter into this saga the United States Supreme Court. Van Buren's administration appeals the case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where, folks, 5 members of the justices, 5 members of the court, 5 justices, are slaveholders or former slaveholders. At the Supreme Court, the Attorney General argues that can you imagine our Attorney General argues that the court should not go behind the Amistad slave papers and inquire as to their accuracy. Instead, the papers should be accepted on their face to show proper respect for another sovereign nation. He argues that the Africans should be returned to Cuba. Roger Baldwin, representing the Africans, argues that the court should examine if the Cubans' paperwork was fraudulent. If the court finds fraud, he says the treaties govern. He argues that the Africans should be declared free to go home to Africa, or if they preferred, to stay in the United States. John Quincy Adams, second president of the United States. Excuse me, son of the second president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. At the Supreme Court, the lawyer everyone is waiting to hear from is former President John Quincy Adams, who at the age of 74 has agreed to represent the Africans in addition to Roger Baldwin. His argument is at times incendiary, sarcastic, eloquent, and haranguing. Now get this, Adams speaks for 9 hours before the United States Supreme Court. Now, let me digress for a moment. Nowadays, attorneys are sharply limited to a portion of just 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Here is an excerpt from John Quincy Adams's argument to the Supreme Court.
That's right. What are we to do with that embarrassing, annoying document? The Declaration of Independence. What of its conceits? All men created equal, inalienable rights, life, liberty, and so on and so forth. What on earth are we to do this? I have a modest suggestion. The other night I was talking with my friend Sinke. He was over at my place and we were out in the greenhouse together. And he was explaining to me how when a member of the Mende, this is people, how when a member of the Mende encounters a situation where there appears no hope at all, he invokes his ancestors. Tradition. See, the Mende believe that if one can summon the spirit of one's ancestors, then they have never left. And the wisdom and strength they fathered and inspired will come to his aid. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams. That's right.
Now, I must tell you parenthetically that there is no way that the United States Supreme Court would allow any, as inspiring as that is. Let me just move to a more pedestrian issue that as a judge and former lawyer, trial lawyer, I will share with you. In these days, there is no way the Supreme Court would allow an oral argument for more than 30 minutes. And I want to show you something. In fact, there are lights on the podium, 3 lights at the United States Supreme Court. Let me show you these lights. When the green light goes on, the attorney begins his oral argument. Yellow light, the attorney has 5 minutes remaining to argue. And the red light, and this is an actual photograph from the United States. Well, let me just show you where the lights are. Here they are. There we go. There are the lights. Green, yellow, and red. And see how this is fascinating. See how close this desk is to the Supreme Court justices? You're only about 8 feet away from all of them. It's quite intimate, actually. The room itself is not intimate, but the closeness of the attorney to the judges is quite clear. Let's move on to the next thing. Now, going back to our story, 2 weeks after the oral argument by the lawyers, the United States Supreme Court announces its decision. It declares that the would-be slaves of the Amistad are, quote, kidnapped Africans who, by the laws of Spain itself, were entitled to their freedom, end quote. They are not criminals. In so ruling, the court said, the ultimate right of human beings in extreme cases is to apply force against ruinous injustice. The Africans could stay in the United States or could return to Africa. The choice was theirs. Abolitionists hope that the Africans will stay in the United States where they'll continue to remind people of slavery. One abolitionist moves them to a farm in Connecticut where they're taught to read and write and tend to a garden. And they're also paraded, unfortunately, around New England as kind of a traveling show, holding church meetings in which Africans describe their homes and their kidnappings. They sing native songs, and they read from the Bible. Cinque quickly develops a reputation as a powerful orator. The Amistad Rebellion captures a popular imagination. A Bowery troupe from New York performs a play about the mutiny and conspiracy and the piracy. Commercial artists converge upon the jail and draw images of Cinque, the leader, and the images are quickly reproduced, and hawked by boys on the streets of northern cities. Hundreds of articles are written about them and poems are written about this story. Eventually, however, it becomes clear to the abolitionists that the Africans want and deserve to return home. The abolitionists appeal to clergymen to accompany the Africans back to their homeland and start a missionary there. And they raise money, commission a ship, and set sail to return to Africa, accompanied by missionaries. So, in 1842, the surviving 35 Africans, one committed suicide by drowning himself in the United States, returned to Sierra Leone. The Africans and the Americans construct a mission in Mendiland, Mendiland. Members of the Amistad Committee later found the American Missionary Association, which is an evangelical organization that supports the Mendi mission abroad and here and actively works for abolition in the United States and for the education of Blacks. As a legal postscript, all but one of the Supreme Court justices sided with the Africans, all but one of them. Many of them support slavery, but it is not the fate of slavery that's at stake in this case. Rather, it is the importation of slaves into the United States that had been banned by federal law in 1808, more than 30 years earlier. Ironically, just 15 years after the Amistad decision, the majority of the United States justices who decided the Amistad case announced their decision in the Dred Scott case that slaves and former slaves are not citizens within the meaning of the United States Constitution, and that blacks had no rights which a white man is bound to respect. Same judges. But the Amistad Trials in the United States Supreme Court decision serves to educate the American public and begins to turn American opinion, at least in the North, against slavery. Slave resistance becomes the dominant political issue of the day. And now, as Paul Harvey used to say, for the rest of the story. Efforts to begin to raise money necessary to transport occurs to bring them back to their Mende homeland. The Amistad slaves, who are strangers in a strange land, are not without their problems. As I said, one of the former slaves drowns in a pond, and he's ruled of suicide. Another is assaulted. Others are victims of racial taunts. It is recognized that it's time to go. The missionaries are recruited to accompany the Africans back to Sierra Leone. So in November 1841, a ship is chartered to carry those Africans back to Freetown, where the governor of Sierra Leone says that the group will be met and guided on a 4-day journey to Mendeland. And after a tearful round of goodbyes, the 35 surviving African slaves of the Amistad and the 4 American missionaries board the ship bound for West Africa. After 50 days at sea, the ship puts down anchor in Freetown Harbor. But their homecoming is bittersweet. Cinque learns that while they're gone, his village had been wiped out by tribal warfare. Members of his family had been killed or captured or sold into slavery, and the newly founded evangelical mission struggles. This is one of the sketches that the artist did of one of the young girls who was in New England when the Amistad slaves were there. One of the captives eventually returns to the United States, where she attends Oberlin College. And here's a sketch of her when she's much younger. This is marketing. After graduating from Oberlin, listen to this, she returns to Africa to become the principal of the mission school. And as to Cinque, there are many different stories, but the one that seems the most plausible and reliable is that he emigrated to Jamaica, but returns to live his last days in Africa near the mission. His funeral service was conducted by a young Black missionary who graduated from Fisk University the year before. Now, that this Fisk University graduate should have conducted the funeral for the leader of the Amistad group was a strange coincidence. Listen to this, because Cinque, in a sense, had been responsible for the founding of Fisk University. You see, the revolt that Cinque started resulted in the formation of the American Missionary Association, which, after the Civil War, moved into the South to educate newly freed slaves, establishing over 500 Black schools and colleges, among them Fisk University, Howard University, Talladega College, and Hampton University. But the story still takes another turn. 25 years after Cinque died, the minister who conducted his funeral service later returned to Michigan to lead a church where he wrote that most of the Amistad slaves remained steadfast in their faith. Some of their children and grandchildren were in the mission when I was there, and one returned with me to the United States and graduated from Fisk University a few years later. 50 years passed between the time the Africans had drifted into New York waters and one of their grandsons returned to enroll at Fisk University. What a wondrous miracle to know that out of this terrible tragedy arose 600 American schools and colleges, among them leading Black universities that exist to this day. So in a sense, when the schooner La Amistad left Havana Harbor as a slave ship, it sailed straight into history. The Amistad case served as a flashpoint in the cause for the abolition of slavery. It emboldened and publicized the abolitionist cause and brought attention and money to their cause. As the years passed, the memory of Amistad waned, but it was kept alive by two groups, the abolitionists and the African-American writers and artists. The story disappears in the late 19th century, only to be resurrected in the 1960s civil rights era. And thanks to Steven Spielberg, the story of La Amistad endures.
These are transcriptions of letters written between our Secretary of State, John Forsyth, and the Queen of Spain, Isabella II. I ask that you accept their perusal as part of your deliberations. Thank you, sir. I would not touch on them now, except to notice a curious phrase, which is much repeated. The Queen again and again refers to our incompetent courts. Now, what, I wonder, would be more to her liking? Eh? A court that finds against the Africans? Well, I think not. And here is the fine point of it. What Her Majesty wants is a court that behaves just like her courts. The courts this 11-year-old child plays with in her magical kingdom called Spain. A court that will do what it is told. A court that can be toyed with like a doll. A court, as it happens, of which our own president, Martin Van Buren, would be most proud. Thank you. Now, this is a publication of the Office of the President. It's called the Executive Review. And I'm sure you all read it. At least I'm sure the President hopes you all read it. This is a recent issue. And there's an article in here written by a keen mind of the South. It's my former Vice President, John Calhoun, perhaps. Could it be? Who asserts that there has never existed a civilized society in which one segment did not thrive upon the labor of another. As far back as one chooses to look, to ancient times, to biblical times, history bears this out. In Eden, where only two were created, even there, one was pronounced subordinate to the other. Slavery has always been with us, and is neither sinful nor immoral. Rather, as war and antagonism of the natural states of man, so too slavery, as natural as it is inevitable. Well, gentlemen, I must say I differ with the keen minds of the South, and with our president, who apparently shares their views, offering that the natural state of mankind is instead, and I know this is a controversial idea, is freedom. Is freedom. And the proof is the length to which a man, woman, or child will go to regain it once taken. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices, to get home.
I don't think I could end it better than with Anthony Hopkins speaking. How can you top that? I'll take any questions that folks might have.
So Dennis, I can read some to you. We have about 10 already. So folks, get your questions in for Dennis. We're going to do rapid fire here. Rosamond asks, did the DeWolf family consider building a slave museum instead of a restaurant?
I don't know what went on in the descendants' minds, but I think they sold that property. It's not maintained by the DeWolfs as a restaurant. They obviously sold it to someone else. But I will tell you that some descendants of the DeWolf family are apoplectic at their ancestral heritage.
Mm-hmm.
They've actually tried to put together some money to put together a documentary as to their notorious role in the slave trade. I don't know what commercial success that's had, but there are some with a conscience. And I'll just leave it at that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kathy asks, what happened to the 4 children who were part of the original slaves being transported to Cuba?
I cannot tell you. I think they did make it up to New Haven because, as you could see from the sketch of Marguerite, she was among several. Whatever happened to them eventually, I don't know. But they were transported to Connecticut, and probably they were probably safe kept and returned. I'm just speculating. They're probably returned to Africa.
Christopher asks, was this decision in Taney's court, T-A-N-E-Y? Did he join the ruling? It seems very much at odds with his Dred Scott decision.
I think it was before Taney's. I think it's pronounced Taney. Although it's spelled Taney, T-A-N-E-Y. It's pronounced Taney. I can't definitively say Taney was on that court. For some reason, it's kind of hard to think that he was. It was 1857 for this Dred Scott decision, and this decision was in the 1830s. I don't know if his span included 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that answer offhand. We can say definitively that 5 of the Supreme Court justices were slaveholders or former slaveholders. I'll look that up, and you know what? I'll get an answer for you on that,
Sure.
Robert.
Yep. Christopher says, wouldn't the strongest, he's talking about legal argument, not moral argument.
Right.
But Christopher says, wouldn't the strongest argument for freedom be that they landed in a free state, or are all ports considered federal jurisdiction due to the interstate international commerce concerns?
Well, I don't. You can have, no, they're not. Just because you land there doesn't automatically make you free. I mean, you're subject. Just because a ship from a foreign nation, which according to its own laws comes into the Boston port, we can't impose our laws on that ship's crew. So I would disagree with that. Mm-hmm. And one other fact I didn't emphasize is the slave catching law or the slave catchers law was a federal law. I mean, it mandated that sheriffs and constables and police officers, according to federal law, had to return slaves that were caught up in the North back south to their rightful owners, under penalty to the sheriffs and the constables. Next question.
Anonymous attendee asks, let me see here. I'll ask this. So he or she says, regarding the caution poster in Boston, I think the one behind you, were the intended recipients of the message actually able to read it, or was the message disseminated in any other way?
I can't say it was disseminated in any way, but we do know that a lot of the blacks in New England, and particularly in Boston, were literate. They were literate, so they could read it. If they couldn't, perhaps they got somebody to help read it for them. And we just got an interlineation from someone that said that Taney was Chief Justice. It was Justice of the Supreme Court, so he did join that court's decision. He was, according to this message, he was on the court in 1836, so he would have participated in this very decision.
Kathy says, she just comments that it's remarkable that a court populated with slave owners or former slave owners could find in favor of the slaves.
You know, that raises a fascinating question to me. Absolutely fascinating question, because I do a lecture on the trial of Elizabeth Freeman, and this is the most fascinating thing of all to me. In 1783 in Massachusetts, a woman named Mumbet, M-U-M-B-E-T, in a small town in Western Massachusetts, heard the Declaration of Independence read and heard the United States Constitution read in a public square, listened to those words and said, "I must be free." She somehow got an attorney to sue for her freedom. And she won before a jury of 12 white men. 12 white men.
Yeah.
Astounding to me.
Linda asks, when was the Spielberg movie made? And I just looked that up. That was 1997.
Okay.
DL asked, you mentioned that slavery was outlawed in Massachusetts and none are recorded in the 1790 census. But this fall, we learned on a National Park Service tour that the Derbys still had an enslaved boy after that date.
Well, I don't know the Derbys, and I'm sure there's an exception to every rule, but I could tell you it was outlawed. If they had a slave, I'm sure they didn't tell too many people about it.
And then I'll read a couple of questions from the chat. Corey asks, how many Africans were on the ship when it left Africa, and how many years between when they were kidnapped and when they returned?
53 left from Africa, and they returned in total of about 4 years later.
Kirk asks, did you enjoy Justice Blackmun's reading of the decision? I thought it was moving.
Justice Harry Blackmun? He died 30 years ago. I don't understand the question.
Well, neither do I.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Sorry,
We have several folks commenting on Tooney or Tiny and his when he joined the court. So that seems to be correct. Michelle says this was so informative and interesting. Thank you to all involved in the presentation. Patricia calls it fascinating. Let me jump back to the Q&A. Let's see. Have you heard of the 1997 opera Amistad by Anthony Davis?
No, but I'm not surprised. As I said, it was an object of great artistry. You know, when you think about the story itself, is a story worth repeating. It's also an interesting story in the sense that I think, just as I was telling you about the Elizabeth Freeman people do rise to the occasion. We do have as Lincoln said, he wanted to appeal to the better angels of our nature. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court did the right thing. In the Elizabeth Freeman case, formerly Mumbet, that was her slave name, 12 white jurors voted against slavery. It's just astounding, and it was upheld by the United States Supreme Court. So I think there's good in all of us. Sometimes we have to look harder in some people for it.
So Kirk clarifies what he was referring to. So in the film Amistad, Justice Blackmun reads the decision in the film. So that's what he was referring to, I guess. Gail says, thank you. There's a few questions we didn't get to, but we're 10 minutes past Q&A here. So I think we will wrap it up. And Nancy says, I follow the judge in all of his presentations. I'm never disappointed. Thank you for all the research and time that you put into these programs, Dennis. They are appreciated. Dennis, do you have any last words before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm just going to give you, those folks who didn't get a chance to have their questions answered, I'm going to give you my email address. It's my personal email address. I don't have like, a staff working for me. So I read the questions and I answer them promptly and completely. The email address is small case letter JDENNISCURRAN @gmail.com. JDENNISCURRAN @gmail.com. And I answer every question. And I will send to Robert, for those of you who might want to see those sketches of the slave ship and the posters that I referred to, I will send my PowerPoint to Robert as soon as this is over, in case you want to look at those documents, some of which are sorted documents, more closely.
Sure. Great. That's great, Dennis. Yeah, happy to share your sources. Absolutely. So, folks, we're going to wrap it there. Want to thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording, link to a feedback survey, and the references and documents that Dennis just referenced. And we'll see Dennis at some point next month. Dennis, I'm still working on a couple of throw some dates at you. We'll figure something out. But I hope everyone enjoys this snowy day here in Massachusetts, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. So thanks so much, Dennis.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, audience. Take care.
All right. Bye.